Number 1. The noise. I lived most of my early life living out in the country in a heavily wooded area. My parents were really the rustic type. We lived in a shack that only had 3 rooms in it. My parents had their bedroom, the kids had theirs, and then there was the main or living room. We had a wood stove in the living room, and that is what heated the house, and my mom made meals on. Other than that, we had an outhouse instead of a bathroom. We also had a shed outside that my dad kept his tools in. The area we lived in had really strong seasons. The summers were really hot, and the winters were really cold. The spring and the fall were the most tolerable seasons, as we didn't have to worry about heating or cooling off. In the summertime, the kids would all spend a lot of time out at the swimming hole. But in the winter, we spent most of our time indoors, trying to keep as warm as we could. There were 5 of us kids all together. We only had one huge feather bed in our room that we all slept in. This was covered in many homemade quilts that were the only things that kept us warm while we were sleeping on the freezing winter nights. I was the second oldest of the 3 kids. I was the oldest boy, with only my sister being older than I was. When I entered my teenage years, I didn't sleep in the feather bed as often. I had some blankets set up on the floor in a corner of the room that I slept on and under. One thing we didn't have was a shortage of blankets. There was also nothing like electricity in the shack. We used lanterns and candles when we needed light. So when winter rolled around and it was dark for the majority of the time, we spent a lot of time only in the dim light. There was a period of time where my dad was away from home for a while. I was 14 years old when this happened. I got the whole lecture about being the man of the house while he was away. I took it to heart. While he was gone, I actually began sleeping on the sofa in the main room. That way, I could hear if either my mom needed me for anything during the night, or if the other kids needed me for anything. On one really cold winter's night, I was laying on the sofa and feeling pretty decent actually. Sleeping in the main room had the advantage that I was in the room with the oven, so it was a bit warmer. There was a snowstorm that night, and the wind was blowing hard, and it was one of the coldest nights that I ever remembered in my life. I had been sleeping, I know that. Of course, I didn't have a clock, so I had no idea how long. But something woke me up. I wasn't sure what it was at first. Of course, the room was very dark, but I looked around, trying to let my eyes readjust in the dark. I thought maybe one of the young kids had come out of the room or something. However, when I was able to finally see around me, there was no one in the room but me. The kid room door was closed, but I knew something had woken me up. I always slept pretty soundly at night, so I continued to look around the room, but didn't see anything. Finally, I heard a faint tapping noise. I looked over at the window at the front of the house. All I could see was the shape of someone or something looking in the window at me. The tapping noise seemed to be a finger that was tapping on the window, as if it was trying to get my attention. I immediately got up off the sofa. As I did, the shape left the window, and there was nothing else out there. I went over to the table to light a lantern so I could see better. As I was trying to light the lantern, I then heard something else. It was a long, scraping noise. It was coming from the front door of the house. It was as if someone was taking their fingernails and slowly scraping them down the length of the door. When it stopped for a moment, it immediately began again. We didn't have a real lock on the door. We had a hook lock on the inside, and of course the lock was hooked, so the door couldn't be opened. I was thankful for that because then, whatever out there began pulling on the door a few times. I was hoping that no one else would wake up, and I figured I would take care of this myself. Dad's gun always sat right beside the door. I went and grabbed it and went over to the door and informed whoever was out there that I had a gun, and they had better stop. After a few more scraping sounds, I heard whoever was out there move away from the door. I should have just left it at that, I know, but I was upset that someone was out there threatening my family. So I unhooked the door and went outside. I saw some footprints that led behind the house, so I followed around the house with a gun. I kept following the footprints until I came upon the chicken coop, and I stopped because I saw something that really concerned me. There were dead chickens laying on the ground. I don't want to go into any details about them, but it wasn't a pleasant sight, and it was a really big deal for such a poor family as mine. I stopped and went back to the shack and locked the door. I didn't sleep anymore that night, only kept guard. In the morning, when there was light, I went out and cleaned up the chicken coop before any of the other kids got up. I didn't want them to know about it. My mom was the only person I told what happened until Dad got home. We lost quite a few egg-laying hens, and that was definitely bad. But even worse was every night, expecting whoever that was to come back. It made sleeping hard, and I didn't get much. But he never came back either. We didn't tell any of the kids about it until they were much older. Number 2. Snow hike. I hear a lot of stories about hiking and camping, but I haven't heard anyone tell many, if any, that take place in the winter. I used to love hiking in the winter around the house that I grew up in. We lived in a rural setting on top of a hill, amongst many other hills. It was pretty cool because living there, you could look down at all the other hills, most lower and some higher, that surrounded the one we lived on. It looked great during all the seasons, and I went hiking and exploring in all of them, but I always liked winter the most. I think I liked it the most in the winter because it felt more like I was by myself when I was out there. The cold never bothered me much, so that wasn't a big deal. I also thought I was much less likely to run into someone who might not have liked it if I was exploring their land. I have to admit to not paying much attention to no trespassing signs. I was 16 years old. This happened on winter break from school. I was beginning to get a little stir-crazy, being in the house all by myself all day. Both of my parents worked, and I was an only child, so for a long time I was just cooped up. It had been snowing pretty regularly throughout the winter break, so the ground was constantly covered in snow. Eventually I decided I had to get out, so I got as bundled up as I needed to, and I got some food and water in my backpack, and I went out to see what I could see. You might think that since I grew up in that house, that I had explored all there is to explore out there, but you would be underestimating exactly how much land was out there where I lived. And although I did often hike in areas over and over again, there was still a lot out there that I hadn't seen. I thought I would head down towards a pond that I often went and visited and sometimes fished in. I never really went beyond the pond, and I thought I would explore and see what was further out that direction. It was going to take me a little extra time to get there, though, as walking in the snow made it a bit harder to walk. The atmosphere was really weird. Although I had been out in the winter like this before, I wasn't sure if I'd ever noticed how quiet it was. There were no bird noises, or animals, or insects, or anything. It was lightly snowing, and the wind was actually blowing with some strong, loud gusts every now and then. However, the whooshing of those gusts were the only noises I was hearing. Other than that, it was eerily quiet. But, eventually, it was in between those gusts of wind that I began to hear something else out there. After getting blasted in the face by freezing air, I heard what sounded like someone else out there walking in the snow. The crunching sound was exactly like the crunching sound my feet were making, and I almost thought it was me, or an echo at least. However, a few times that I stopped, I was able to still hear the snow crunching around me. It didn't really concern me right away. I mean, there wouldn't be any dangerous animals out there at that time of year, and I had never come across one anyway. If someone was out there, I would just tell them I got lost and that would be it. But later, as I was walking in between many gusts of wind, I thought I heard someone whistling. Now, this was much harder to make out than the walking noises were, but the sound of it between the gusts was actually pretty eerie. I kept looking around to see if I could find anyone, but I wasn't able to do so. It wasn't until I was getting closer to the pond that I noticed anything else. This time, I came across a set of footprints. There was only a really light dusting of snow over them, so they had to have been somewhat fresh. It was at that point that there was no denying that I wasn't the only one out there. Again, this was not necessarily something to be afraid of. It was likely just someone else hiking, or the owner of the land checking something out. I had no reason to think that there was anything bad going on, but that didn't stop me from feeling a little uneasy about the whole thing. I got to the area that the pond was in. I was wondering if it had frozen enough over so that I could walk on it. But as I got closer to it, that quickly became the last thing on my mind. What I saw was completely horrifying. There was a person lying on the frozen pond, and he was covered in blood. After I got over the alarm, I went to check to see if he was still alive. I was expecting him to be dead, but thankfully he wasn't. But I wasn't sure how much longer he would be able to live without help. It was the most strenuous thing I'd ever done in my life, but I was able to get the guy to his feet and support him on the long hike back to my house. In addition to the physical effort, I was also concerned about coming across the guy who had done this to him. It made the entire thing stressful. I was able to get the guy to the house and call an ambulance. It took a while to get to my house, but thankfully, I did it in time. The guy had been hiking with a friend of his, and was shocked when his friend had attacked him. But it was most definitely the guy that I heard walking and whistling when I was out there hiking. The guy was later picked up and prosecuted. But you have to wonder what might have happened if I had come across the guy. If he had done something to me, then both me and that guy on the pond may have died on that snowy day. Number 3, the long walk. During my 30s, I was going through a pretty rough patch in life. I live in the tri-state area of Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia. Economically, it is not the strongest place in the country. So there have been a lot of times when I have been out of a job. But not only that, there is a lot of drinking and drug use in the area too. I think that is because there is really not a lot of other things to do. Although I am pretty much clean from all that stuff now, I definitely wasn't when I was younger. That probably added to the difficulty of keeping a job. If you know anything about the area, it is largely country. There are a lot of towns, but the only real city in the area, I guess, would be Huntington in West Virginia. But in between the towns, there was tons and tons of countryside. I had a place to stay with a few friends of mine. It was out in the hills, and it was an old shack that was barely being held together, but we were able to live there rent-free, as long as we did some work on the surrounding area during the spring, summer, and fall. There were orchard trees and berry bushes out there, and we would have to harvest them for the guy who owned the property. In exchange, we got to live in the house, and he paid us a very little bit of money to go along with it. In the winter time, this gave us a lot of free time, but we would have to do odd jobs if we needed any money then. My life was largely like that for quite a few years. I'm probably not going to get a lot of sympathy for my character at the time, but I was in town in Ironton at a friend's getting high. I was there all night, and when I got up the next day, I knew I was in for it. One of the friends I lived with had driven me into town, but he had a job that day and couldn't get me back home, so I would have to walk and try to hitch a ride. It was pretty cold that day too. It was snowing, but it wasn't much of a snow. There were just flurries, and it didn't seem like it would cause me any problem. I stopped at a gas station and bought some cigarettes. When I came out, I was surprised to come across a cousin of mine who I hadn't seen in years. She had moved out of the area and lived in the Chicago area a long time ago, but I guess she was in town visiting her mom. I was hoping that I could manage to get a ride back to my place, but they weren't able to do that. What they were able to do was take me to the bridge that they were going to cross to get back into Kentucky. I lived in Ohio, so I would have to walk the rest of the way, unless I was lucky enough to hitch a ride. I wasn't so lucky. By the time I got out to the hills, I hadn't been able to get anyone to pull over and give me a ride. There were going to be less people driving up in the hills. However, normally, those people were more likely to give someone a ride. So I kept my hopes up that someone would end up coming by. It had taken me a long time to get there, and the sun was already going down. It would be dark long before I got home. I didn't mind walking along the road in the dark, though. It was mainly the cold that I had a problem with. The sun went down and nothing had happened. One truck drove up the road, but it didn't stop for me to try and get a ride from it. So I just had to keep walking in the dark and the cold. I was freezing by that point and could only think about getting to our house and heating up by the stove or getting under a really warm blanket or both. And then I noticed some lights coming back toward me. I kept walking, and the lights came bearing down on me. At the last moment, I had to jump out of the way to keep from being hit. As I looked back at the vehicle that almost hit me, it looked to be the same truck that I had seen going the other direction. After a while, I began to smell something. It smelled like something was burning, and I eventually saw smoke up in the sky. I wasn't sure what to think about it, but I kept on walking, determined to get home. It was, as I got closer to the house, that I realized that the house was on fire. Not only that, but the fire was spread out to the fruit trees and bushes as well. There was a huge fire, and I had no idea what to do about it. All I could think of was try to get to the house and see if any of my buddies were in the house. But fortunately, it looked like nobody was home at the time. The only thing I could think of to do after that was to walk over to the house of the owner of the land, which would likely take me another hour out in the cold to do. But not long after I began walking, he pulled up in his own car. He had seen the fire from his house and came out there. I met up with him, insisting to him that I hadn't started the fire, but he hadn't suspected me of it. But the words he told me have chilled me more than the cold of that night had. "No, I know who did this," he told me. "You and your buddies are lucky you weren't home, though, because knowing them boys, you'd have died in that fire." How lucky I was that my cousin never gave me a ride that day. I missed those arsonists by only about an hour. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. As normal, I want to start by thanking my paid Patreon subscribers, starting with my 2 VIPs, Chiamerah Cat and Pixie Hopper 8. I also want to thank Heidi H, Chronic J, Stinky News, EricaOdd, and Tracy Sellars and Kelli Clark. Now, whether or not you're a Patreon member or not, I'd recommend you checking out the Patreon link in my description, because one of my Patreon subscribers, Chronic J, who has been a really good supporter of my channel, did a short interview with me. This was posted on her blog. The link for this will be included at my Patreon site. All members and all non-members will be able to access the link to go to her blog to go ahead and check out that interview. I also want to thank Chronic J for taking the time to do the interview with me. It was very pleasant, she is very nice, has a very wonderful voice, and it was just an all-around good experience. So thank you, Chronic J. I appreciate it, and I hope to do it again sometime too. In the meantime, if you like the video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please hit the subscribe button and the bell so you'll be notified of new videos. Leave me a comment, which I'll do my best to get back to, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you want narrated on Killer Orange Cat, especially if it's a Christmas story since I'll be doing a Christmas video next week, please send it to the address included in the description. Now I'd like to mention all my free Patreon members, starting with my newest member, Broken Angel, Anthony Bowers, Remi, Venikins, Rose Metro, Woofer McWooferson, Cindy Cleveland, Vanapira Rayne, William H, Alien Unicorn 13, Kathryn Lynch, The Bama Guy 334, Michael Vasquez, Bonnie Lynn, Collet Bond, Krista Pike, Prince UVA, HF Creations, Bonnie Gibbs, Linda Moore, DJ Lira, Evil Black Cat, Lori Hicks, Lisa Herman, and Krystal Robin. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.